Hello and welcome back to part 3 of lecture 2. So what I want to do in this final part of lecture 2 is finish off talking about constructing the narrative of the paper or the report that we have to write. So we finished off the last part of the lecture with talking about the introduction. What I want to do now is move on to the literature review, which is really will form probably the largest part of your report. So the literature review should expand on topics raised in the introduction that you write. So again, remember there shouldn't be surprises. So you should have already given the reader a good idea of the areas that they're going to find in the literature review. So it should provide the reader with an understanding of the particular area that you've chosen, the technical details in that field that are necessary to understand the report, understand what you're going to be talking about in your report. And it should present various aspects of a particular application or maybe a method or arguments that are put forth in the literature and comment on them. So it's really important, that idea of and comment on them. Remember, this is a critical review, critical analysis. It's not just simply summarizing papers. So it's not sufficient simply to present information as kind of a descriptive writing. So this paper talked about A, B, C, D. The next paper talked about etc., etc. That's not enough. Okay, so you must have this critical analysis, and then from that thinking that you've done, write something critical about the paper. So this paper talked about A, B, and C, but there appeared to be limitations because it didn't talk about D, whatever that might be. Okay, and make the wider and relevant reading self-evident. So it explained to the reader the wider picture. Organize the information in a logical manner. So you won't be able to do this really until you've read most of the papers, but try and organize it in sections that flow nicely, that make some sort of logical sense when you're talking about it. So you may be talking about robot locomotion, maybe the field that you're talking about. So you may have a section on wheeled robots. You may have a section on legged robots. You may have a section on flying robots. You may have a section on swimming robots, for example. So different types of locomotion. And then within those sections, that's when you do your analysis of the papers that you've read. That's when you do your critical analysis. So group them into areas that make sense. And you may occasionally find that a reference appears in more than one section. That's fine. That's fine to do that. And by the end of the literature review, the reader should have a good idea of what you're going to focus on in the next section. Okay, so how the review is organized, the critical analysis gives us a clue of what topics you're moving on into the next section, where the next section is identifying the gaps in the literature. So during your analysis, during the literature review, you should have identified, it should be clear when you've written about papers where you think there are gaps, where you think that people haven't covered those areas. So what you do in identifying the gaps, you draw these together, picking up the various points that you found in the literature where you think people haven't covered, and state the problem that you think is currently unsolved. And of course, in the limited time you've got, in fact, it may be solved somewhere and you just haven't found those papers. But from the papers that you've read, what is the problem that you think is unsolved? And explain why the problem is important, what the possible applications might be in a solution, if you could find a solution to that gap, and how it will advance the field, how it will move the general field of research in that area forward. And then once you've identified the gap and you've explained the gap and why it's important, then, okay, what about a possible solution? What about a proposal for new research? And of course, we can't test this. This is just ideas that you've come up with, having read the papers, thought about the gap, and then think about, okay, how can we solve this gap? How can we fill that gap? So propose a new research, an idea of how to take the problem forward and how to to fill the gap that you've identified. And this should be motivated by the analysis that you've made, the critical analysis that you've made of the papers that you've read in the literature review. And you know, we understand you can't give huge amounts of detail, but try and give sufficient detail to convey your ideas across to the reader. And if something similar exists, maybe not exactly the same, but something similar exists, explain how the two ideas are different, how your idea is different from the other things that are out there. Okay, let me just briefly talk about ethical issues. We'll hear more about this in a separate workshop. But engineers, so this is a quote from this link at the bottom here, from the Royal Academy of Engineering. If you're interested more in ethics, and I suggest you click on this link and read more, but it gives a really nice summary just on this slide of some of the things that they point out on this webpage. So engineers invent the future, and I think that's one of the great things of being an engineer. Yeah, we get to invent things that make a difference, and their work affects the lives of millions of people, often for the better, hopefully not so much for the worse, and maybe that's where ethics comes in some respects. But that raises enormous ethical issues in every branch of engineering, from computing through to biotech and energy to civil and avionics. So engineering professionals work to enhance the well-being of society. In doing so, they are required to maintain and promote high ethical standards and challenge unethical behavior. So fundamental principles being honesty and integrity, respect for life, law, the environment and public good, accuracy and rigor in the things that we do, and leadership and communication. And so ethics is important in everything that we do, and it's useful, it's important in your report. When you come up with your new idea to fill the gap, you consider any possible ethical issues that might apply to that new solution. So think about that. As I said, we will have another lecture on that later, but you should get the idea about ethical issues for things that we do, in everything that we do. And you know, you might want to look at that Royal Academy of Engineering link to read a bit more about ethical issues for engineering. So the next section of the report in the different sections that we've outlined is further work. So you've got your gap. You've suggested a way that we might go to fix that gap. So the next point is how do we go about testing it? What further work would we do to do that? So proposing a course of action, how would your potential solution be tested? How would you test your new ideas? So very briefly, propose experiments and comparisons, maybe a proof of concept or a prototype to actually show your idea would work. And remember, we talked in the previous lecture about hypotheses and how we test them. So what experiment would you produce that would reject a hypothesis? What would be your hypothesis, and therefore maybe what would be your null hypothesis? Remember, we talked about those in a previous lecture. So that's an important part of this further work. Comparison and performance of current solutions. So how would you be able to test your potential solution is better or worse than ones that are already out there? And justify that further work. What would you learn if this plan was carried out? And of course, you're not going to do it in this module, but it's just a proposal of what would you do in the future. So just have a think about that, and that's another section of the report. And then finally in the report, there's this summary and conclusion section, which you'd expect to see in all papers, all reports, okay? And what you want that to be is a balanced and appropriate summary of the main point. So not biased in any way. Remember, we talked about bias in a previous lecture. So try and balance your ideas, try and balance your thoughts and your analysis. Okay. So what was the report about? What did you conclude from your literature review? And explain how your proposed solution fits within the field and its potential importance. So remember, we talked at the beginning about writing the report about tell the reader what's coming up, the bulk of the report, and then tell the reader what you've written about. So this is telling the reader what you've written about, really. if you cover those main 3 points, what the report's about, what did you conclude, and what proposed solution did you come up with, then that should come up with a nice summary and conclusion at the end of your report. So just to remind you again that this is the structure. I would really strongly suggest you keep to these headings. It will make everything easier for everybody if you keep to these 7 headings. Then that will make it nice. It will structure your report well. It will be something that we're expecting to read, and that will all be good. Okay. So some tasks for the next workshop. So we should be far enough along now that you want to start thinking about getting the templates ready for when you start reading your report. So install and configure any software and templates that you might need for writing the report. So most people either fall into the category that they're going to write it using Word, or they're going to write it using LaTeX. I don't mind which one you use. You can use whichever one you want, but there are IEEE templates. Remember that it says here that you should be in an IEEE format when you write your report. So there are IEEE templates, both for LaTeX documents and Word documents. So you want to download those onto your computer. You want to collect some way of collecting your citation. So remember, we talked about a citation manager. If you need to download the citation manager like Mendeley, then please do that now. Get that ready. Okay. And work out how you're going to save the PDF versions of the papers that you've read. Okay. And then once you've done all that, what I'd like for the workshop is for you to produce a very simple PDF document in the IEEE format that you've downloaded, okay, with a very small amount of text, maybe a paragraph of text, and include in that one citation, so one paper, and have that paper included in the text as well. So just so that you've got the right format and that you know how to import a citation into that document. Okay. And remember what we talked about before, ensure that your work is frequently backed up. So try and get all that ready so you've actually got a one-page sheet when we come to the workshop that we can look at. Small amount of text, maybe a heading, yeah, in the right format, in this IEEE template format, and a paper included within that text. Okay, that's the end of lecture 2 now. So that's the end of lecture 2. Lecture 3, we'll be talking in more detail about the reading. So for now, that's the end, and I'll see you again soon. Okay, thanks very much.